Well, we saw this week that Chinese officials tried to body block Australian journalist Cheng Lei at a press briefing. And then we learned today that Cheng Lei was actually barred completely from attending another press event with the Chinese Premier. This time, it was his meeting with Peter Dutton. Cheng Lei wrote on Sky News that Australia is appeasing China and she's not surprised by it. She said, for a moment, it reminded me of being in residential surveillance where shifts of 2 guards were glued to me every minute of the day. Anthony Albanese wanted to make this visit by the Chinese Premier all about pandas and penfolds. But when the Chinese officials felt emboldened on our soil to bully Cheng Lei, well, the Prime Minister failed to fiercely protect his Australian citizen or our values of freedom of the press. It seems like China may have already bought Australia's silence. Despite its foreign interference, its espionage, its extensive malicious cyber attacks, and its appalling human rights abuses, where whistleblowers and journalists regularly disappear and Muslim Uyghurs are subject to terrible treatment in slave labour camps. As I said on Monday night, Albanese condemns our democratic ally in Israel more than he does the greatest aggressor in our region, China. To discuss this and more, former Home Affairs Secretary and longtime powerful diplomat Mike Pezzullo joins me now for an exclusive interview. Mike, thank you very much and welcome to the program. Look, I want to start with this incident,
Sharri.
This treatment of Cheng Lei this week by the Chinese officials. What's your reaction to what happened?
Well, like most Australians, if not all Australians, I was appalled, particularly in the case of the first incident. That main committee room, which is in the centre of Parliament House, for those of your viewers who have never been there, is where parliamentary inquiries are held, estimates hearings and the like. It's actually the citadel of our democratic scrutiny, our parliamentary scrutiny of the executive. And to have in that room that body blocking occurring, I thought was disgraceful. It was appalling. I do want to applaud the quick-witted actions by the officers. I believe that they're from the Prime Minister's department, who were trying as best as they could with grace, dignity, and I think very good judgment to try, without making a big scene, to try to move particularly the tall blue-suited gentleman on. And those officers should be, I think, praised for their charm, their grace, their dignity, but also their resolve. It shouldn't come to that in that room. I've sat in that room many, many times, been quizzed by senators, and perhaps it's an alien practice for officials from communist China to comprehend the idea of officials being the subject of scrutiny, particularly in that room. I was appalled.
Indeed. Well, what about how the Prime Minister reacted to this? He was asked about it in a couple of media interviews. What did you make of his response?
Oh, well, Sharri, you'll have to excuse me. These days I'm a retired Canberra pensioner. I don't sort of follow the day-to-day media monitoring in the way that I used to. I have read some discussion and some commentary that suggests that initially there was a degree of dismissal and then there was a hardening of the position. Where the government seems to have got to, which is to register a strong complaint, is where we should have started. The only thing I noticed in the commentary that I do want to make a point of and take some exception to is any suggestion that we should be putting that this is somehow comprehensible or indeed excusable on the basis of different political values or different political systems. No, our house, our rules, they need to understand coming into our territory, our terrain, that they behave according to our principles and rules. I've got no doubt that if the government has said that complaints have been lodged, that that's been done and done hopefully candidly. I'm sure it's been done candidly, but we shouldn't dismiss it through some sort of political or cultural relativism.
I think we're seeing it, and you've noted this, a tendency by the Albanese government to deal with all of these different incidences in isolation. So whether it's Cheng Lei's bullying or the sonar attack on our Navy divers or Chinese aggression towards Filipino fishing vessels, all dealt with in isolation. But when you put it together, Mike Pezzullo, what's the nature of the China that we currently face?
Well, the character of the regime matters. And what I'm going to say, or what I'm about to say, Sharri, is not a reflection on Chinese culture, the Chinese people, who, like us, go about their lives seeking the best for their families, drawing on their rich historical traditions and doing the best they can to build a better future. This is not about the Chinese people. But the regime is a Leninist communist regime that believes in the absolute authority of the party, the absolute authority of the party to control all organs, not just of the state, but also the economy, the culture, and indeed politics. And therefore, it's such a dissimilar regime that if we don't put at the centre of our analysis the character of that regime, we're going to get it wrong every time. And we're going to be surprised by these individual events, whereas what we should be doing is aggregating a view of the regime, particularly in three dimensions. One, strategic. Its strategic goal is to push the United States out of the Indo-Pacific and to start to dictate terms to the countries that are in the Indo-Pacific, including Australia, but whether it's Japan, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's countries in ASEAN, Australia, and we can get to those strategic issues in a moment if you wish. Secondly, their interference in their own economy and their weaponising of their economy such that they're distorting supply chains, whether it's pharmaceuticals or other components that are critical, or they're introducing risk into technology such as 5G, that basically a lot of their products and services become untrustworthy. That is a function of the character of the regime. And thirdly, that political and cultural relativism that I spoke of earlier, there's a paradox here, Sharri, that is at one level mind-blowing. For Marxists who believe in objective forces of history and that there's only one objective truth, for them to say, oh, but actually civilisations are different and we can all have our own politics. And these so-called Western norms are culturally specific to the West. Like parliamentary scrutiny of the executive, courts, the rule of law, the prevention of arbitrary detention, etc. The ability of people to go to courts and to have decisions taken by officials overturned. I think we should be standing up for the universality of those principles and not accepting that relativism. So it's the character of the regime that I'm drawing attention to, Sharri.
You've just said that if we don't realise the threat, the reality of China, we risk getting it wrong. Do you think we're getting it wrong at the moment? And, you know, I'll just draw your attention to the current government's approach to China. I mean, we see the Prime Minister often use catchphrases like that we need to disagree where we must and that we've stabilised relations. But are we actually disagreeing where we must? Or do you think China has effectively bought our silence?
I think there's some nuance here that we just quickly need to tease out. I think if we fall into the trap of making the relationship purely bilateral, that is to say, not engaging in building coalitions and in building and banding together with our other like-mindeds, we will fall into a trap where, for the sake of improvements in trade, which are not to be sneezed at, although it does pass strange that we're applauding the lifting of restrictions that never should have been put in place in the first place if they were truly trade restrictions, as opposed to weaponising, for instance, the trade in lobsters or the trade in wine. But let's leave that to one side. Those barriers being lifted are good. The exporters here who supply high-quality produce, it's great that they're going to get back into those markets. But we shouldn't accept that that's normal behaviour, where turning those trade linkages into political weapons and then having those barriers lifted is something for us to applaud and congratulate. The Chinese approach is to divide and conquer. What they want is a bilateral relationship with everyone other than the Americans, because they realise that the Americans are a great power such as themselves.
Apologies for interrupting, but just to bring you back to the point, do you think in the Australian government, the Albanese government, seeking to get China to lift those trade sanctions, which, as you say, should never have been in place in the first instance, in getting them to do that, have they effectively bought our silence, our subjugation?
No, and this is a point I was just about to get to, and I apologise for meandering a little bit along the way. Getting those bilateral wins is important. The thing is, what do you do after that? Having stabilised the relationship, having normalised it, which is the other word that's used for those who propose or propound this approach, you then can't retract from the banding together that was in evidence in the recent past, such as through the Quad, the work we've been doing with Japan and the Philippines, calling them out on the origins of COVID, for instance. In other words, if we trade away those multilateral or regional groupings and the bandings in order to gain these bilateral benefits, which really aren't benefits because they shouldn't have been punishments in the first place anyway, that's where I think we're at risk of policy failure. In other words, yes, the bilateral engagement is fine. Having the visit here is fine, notwithstanding the atrocity in our parliament in relation to Cheng Lei.
Yeah,
but
okay.
having those having that trade engagement is fine. It's what you do next that I'm concerned about.
What are you concerned about?
Well, are we going to pause, be reticent and pull back on things like building the capacity for American forces and Australian forces to operate out of Australia in wartime conditions, which is at the heart of our force posture initiatives. B-52 bombers going into Tyndall, the submarines, the rotational force going into Stirling. These are very good initiatives.
You think this is a risk? You think China would be pushing for us to pull back on those things?
I've got no doubt. I've got no evidence at all that we are pausing. We're probably not going as fast on those things as we should. We need to probably up the tempo. China, in their dream state of Australia, would have Australia absolutely renouncing all of those initiatives. They would prefer that we would close down the joint facilities. They would prefer that we didn't have any of those force posture initiatives with the Americans.
I just want to get to a couple of other areas and we don't have too much time left. You were the principal author of the 2009 Defence White Paper, and in it you pointed out the future military threat posed by China. Are we prepared for war now?
Well, regrettably, that was 15 years ago. We should have upped the tempo of both our defence spend as well as the bringing into commission and service of the large platforms, things like the 12 large submarines, the general purpose frigates that were announced in that white paper. That opportunity was lost some 15 years ago and indeed since, so it's on both sides of politics. It's now too late to bring those platforms into the timeframes that we need, so we need to rethink with a larger fleet of perhaps more basic capabilities such as drones to act as substitutes, because we don't have 10 to 15 years to build up that kind of force. So it does concern me. And given that we've got a policy of defence self-reliance where we don't want to rely on the combat assistance of the United States or indeed anyone else, it troubles me that there's some glaring gaps now, as I've written about for ASPI, in relation to things like missile defence. In other words, if we had to deploy missile defence batteries, we could only deploy American ones into Australia to defend our own territory against ballistic missile and other forms of missile strike. That is concerning.
Well, just before you go, Mike Pezzullo, I reported a few months ago that there's a push to strip you of your Order of Australia award, and that they've written a show cause letter to you, a formal letter. Does this disappoint you?
Well, before it potentially disappoints me if that action is going to be taken, it slightly puzzled me. I've gone back and sought reasons. They weren't really very particular about the reasons. So I've left it there, and I'd probably, given that it's the subject of a confidential process, I would prefer to say not much more than that. But before I get disappointed about it, I, at the moment, choose to be puzzled about it.
Yeah, puzzled, and it does sound like perhaps engaging in that formal confidential process. Mike Pezzullo, really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this very important issue of the threat of China and how we deal with it as a nation. Really appreciate your time this evening.